Nathan Donnelly, Technical Horticulturist here with CropKing, and today we're going to be going over assembling the NFT 8.4 system. So with that system, you get 4 NFT channels that are all 8 feet long. It goes through and comes with the nutrient reservoir, the drain line, all the plumbing pieces that we need, and our frame assembly. Then what you're going to need to go through and assemble this is going to be your dead blow hammer, 1/2-inch wrench, 1/2-inch socket, and then when we get to the plumbing, you'll want to go through and need a pair of channel locks, Teflon tape, gloves for when we're going through and doing our gluing, drop cloth so we don't make a giant mess of everything. So once we have everything laid out, we want to make sure that everything has arrived. So with your system, you'll go through and get this pull sheet that goes through and states everything that should be here. And the first thing I'm going to check out is the frame. So I should have 2 parts that are 87 inches long. So I've got these 2 here, and they are both 87 inches long. And then I should have 2 pieces that are 85 inches long. And those 2 are 85. And then I should have 6 pieces that are 29 inches long. That would be these guys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then I should have 3 pieces that are 34 inches long. And that would be these 3. And then 1 piece that is 32 inches long. That would be this piece. And 2 pieces that are 7 inches long. And that would be these guys. So we are good to go. All of our frame pieces are here. And we've got all our nuts and bolts and so on and so forth. And we'll get started on assembly here. So step 1 in our instructions is going through and gluing the end caps onto your channels. There's a QR code here that you can go through and scan. It'll take you right to our YouTube video where we go through and explain how to get our end caps glued onto our channels. Please watch the video before you start this to go through and help reduce the risk of your channels going through and ending up leaking when we start running water through the system. We're going to start assembling our frame for our channels. So in order to go through and get started with this, we're going to need our 2 pieces that are 87 inches long and our 3 pieces that are 34 inches long. So when we go through and we put this together, our 34-inch tubes are going through and laying perpendicular to our 87-inch tubes. And when we go through and we put our bolt through, we're going to put it through from the top, going through the top of the 34-inch piece, and then our nut will go through and go on the bottom side against the 87-inch piece. Our bolt, our washer, that'll then go through and go through our 2 pieces, and then we will do another washer and our nut, and we'll go through and get that all tightened down. Nathan's tidbit here is that I'm going to go through and set these up on these blocks of wood so that I'm not wrestling with these pieces trying to push my bolts through. And we'll repeat this on all 4 corners. Our bolt goes through. Washer on the bolt head, washer on the bolt, nut on the bolt. I like to go through and leave everything loose until I get everything all lined up, and then I'll go back through and tighten everything up. All right, so now we've got our 4 corners tacked in, and these bar here was 87 inches long. These tubes are each an inch, so that takes us down to 85, right? So to go through and find the center of this, we go through 85 divided by 2 is going to go through and be 42.5. But since we're going to have 1/2 inch going this way, 1/2 inch going this way, that'll go through and take up that 85th inch, which actually goes through and takes us down to 84. So 42 inches from inside to inside, 42 inches from inside to inside. So now that we have everything roughed in and dried into place, I'm just going through and eyeballing the square on this, because once we go through and we start to put the legs on, it should square up pretty well for us. I'm going to go through and just tighten these just enough so that as I'm maneuvering things and things are moving around, that the nuts don't end up falling off of our bolts. We are looking to attach our legs, which are all right here. When you look at these, one end goes through and has this plug. That's for our feet that go through and allow us to get our correct slope. I'm going to put those in after I have my legs all attached, so that they're up off the ground and easier for me to deal with. If you're going through and you're building this on the ground, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this over and have my legs going through and pointing up to go through and fasten them in. And our crossbars, those 34-inch ones, are now going to go through and be facing down. We're going to go through and be attaching it to our 87-inch long piece. and it is going to be flush with the top of that 87-inch piece or flush with the bottom of the 34-inch piece. When we're going through and we're putting our legs on, make sure that your foot thread is facing the correct direction, because the last thing we want to do is think we got everything built and realize that we have to flip all of our legs over. And so then after I get everything finger tight, I go through and I just tighten that down enough so that that leg's not going to want to go through and flop over. Now we go through and we take our leveling feet, and I like to go through and screw them in all the way down, just so that once I start to go through and set my system up, I know that I've got the most amount of change available for getting as much slope as I need based on my floor, based on how my system's oriented, so on and so forth, to make sure that we get that appropriate slope. So across the 34-inch direction, or the narrow side of the table, we want to go through and have that be perfectly level. And then the long way of the table, we want to go through and basically have 1 inch of fall every 4 feet. And since this is an 8-4 system, my feed side, where the water's going through, our nutrient solutions going into the system, is going to end up being 2 inches higher than the side where it's going through and it's draining back into our reservoir tank. In step 3, we're going to take our 2 85-inch pieces, and they're going to go through across here to add additional support to our legs. Another option for this system is the reservoir cart, to go through and make it simpler to take your reservoir in and out, to go through and drain it when needed. If you're thinking that you're potentially going to add this later, the next step is we're adding those 85-inch support bars. You'll see that the system here is not wide enough for this to come out through the end, so when we do this support bar, this reservoir trolley, we want to go through and make sure that we leave enough space to go through and have it come out from the side. So in order to be able to do that from the ground to the top of the reservoir, I'm looking at 18 inches, and that's going to be right at the top of the reservoir. So I want the bottom of my support bar to be at 19 inches so that this can go through and freely move back and forth. And each one of these hole spacings is 1 inch. So we're going to come up 19 of them and go through and attach our 85-inch bar piece. So count up again, 19, this is 19th hole. Come up here, move this so it'll go in, put our washer and then our nut. And then as long as I know how to count and measure, you go through and see that we can now move our reservoir in and out just fine from the sides. Our drain line. So here's where we go through and we need our 32-inch bar and our 2 7-inch bars. And we are going to go through and we are going to attach them to this end. It doesn't necessarily matter which end you go through and attach it to, but that end is just going to go through and end up being your drain end. That goes through and comes in right here on the inside. Again, we've got our bolt and our washer coming down through the top. That then goes through here. Then goes through here. Drops down through there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back through here now that my frame's all done. I'm going to make sure everything's nice and square and plumb. And then I'm going to go back through and tighten all of my bolts back down, make sure everything's good and tight. So now that we've got our frame all together, we can go through and put in these finishing caps. So basically anywhere where there is going to go through and be an exposed end, we can go through and cap that off. When you do this, make sure that that V that's in this cap is going the same direction as your bolt, because that's supposed to go through and give us give to make sure that that can go through and seat around our bolt. All right, so now that we're going through and getting into our plumbing, I'm gonna make all of my cuts, push all my pieces together before we go and attach it to the system. So we've got 4 channels, so we need to go through and make 4 different assemblies. This thinner black tubing is gonna go through and be what goes into the channels, and we need to cut this into 2 different pieces per channel. We're gonna go through and have a 3-inch piece. So I got my tape measure here. I measure out about 3 inches, mark that, use my knife to go through and cut that piece off. And then I also need a 12-inch piece for each channel. So I go through, use my tape measure off that 12 inches, use my knife, and then I've got this extra tubing left over. If I went through and made any mistakes, I can go through and cut additional pieces. Now, that goes through and gets attached to our Veriflow valve. So the Veriflow valve goes through and allows us to adjust the flow rate going out to our channel. So you go through and you see on here that there's this arrow that's pointed on here. If it's pointing the same direction as our valve is running, that's all the way open. And then when we go through and we turn it perpendicular to the valve, that goes through and has it closed. Goes into the 3-inch piece and then goes on to the 12-inch piece. When I attach these, I like to make sure that I stick with the natural curvature of the feed tubing. It's just much easier to go with the direction that it naturally wants to bend than going through and trying to fight it with the direction that it doesn't want to go. So again, we attach the 3-inch piece. Then on the other side, we do the 12-inch piece. And again, sticking with that natural curvature. We've got our 1/2-inch black main tubing, and then our instructions say to go through and cut these that are going to go through and be in between our reducing tees. We will need 3 pieces that are 7.5 inches long to go between all of those. So here, we take our tape, we measure out 7.5 inches, use our knife to go through and cut it. And then again, go through and use this one as our gauge. So that's 1, that goes through and makes for 2. That goes and makes for 3. Then I'm taking my reducing tees. They're gonna go through and just be pushed in line. So that's 1. And that's 2. Take another piece of our black tubing. And that's 3. Take our last piece of black tubing. And that is 4. Now, that 3-inch piece is what goes through and connects onto our reducing tee. So 1 there, 1 there, 1 there, and 1 here. And now we'll go through, we'll get reset, and I'll show you how we get this attached onto our frame. So now that I have my trunk line and my lines that are gonna go to my channels made up, I like to set this underneath of this bracket here. And I take my zip tie and I go through this hole, and I'm gonna leave this a little bit loose because once I get my channel set up here, I'll adjust these to where I feel that it needs to be, and then I'll tighten them down so that they don't want to go through and walk around on me later. But this then allows me to leave this hang here so I can get everything else plumbed up and set up the way that I want it to be. So now we're going to go through and install our pump. When we open our pump, you'll go through and you'll see that there's this bag in here that has all sorts of different fittings. The one that we're wanting to go through and use is this guy. It's the one that's got the 1/2-inch display on it. I go through and I take one of the rubber washers, goes through and it gets slid onto those threads, and we take our pump. This gets threaded into the top of the pump. Go through and make holes in the top of your reservoir lids. So I went through and I chose to put my holes here in this ridge so that if anything were to leak or end up on top of it, that it can drain through this hole here and we don't end up having water sit on here, because if water gets on here, it drains back into the tank through the seams. The hole for my pump is 3/4 inches, and then the hole for my return line, which we'll talk about in a minute, is 1 inch in diameter. So I drilled this out using a pyramid bit. Other option would be a Fastener bit or a hole saw. So now that we have our pump ready to go, we put it into the tank and we take our power cord and feed it up through that 3/4 inch hole that we made. And that's why we make a 3/4 inch hole for a 1/2-inch tube, is so that it's big enough for our plug to come in through. Then we take our 1/2-inch tubing, we feed it down through into the reservoir, and then we attach it to the barb on our pump. I like to go through and set my pump in the opposite corner. This is just so that if I do end up needing to move my reservoir around, that I've got enough extra length inside of the tank to be able to move that reservoir around with. Since I don't have my drain line in yet, I want to make sure that I can get that all matched up, because then if I need to move it back or move it forward, I've got all that extra length. And then using our zip ties, and you can choose. I like to go through and follow this top rail. And again, I'm taking my zip ties, I'm feeding them through the holes that are here in the side, and I'm gonna leave them loose so that I can make adjustments later if I need to. Going through, and when I put the zip ties on, I'm making sure that I'm not wrapping them over the top bar or these bars here, because I don't want them to interfere with my channels. Now that I've got my feed line running all the way up through the side, I'm taking the line here and I'm turning it around the corner to see where I need to go through and cut that feed tube at to attach it onto this reducing tee. So that's right here. I take my knife and I go through and I cut that off. And you want this to be a gradual turn, because we don't want to go through and have too much, have it be too short, because if we kink that, that's going to go through and impede our flow, right? So a nice gradual swooping turn there. That goes through and gets pushed on right as such. Now that we've got from our pump to our reducing tees plumbed in, we can't just leave this open and have water and flowing all over the place. So this piece can be as long or as short as you want it to be. This is one way you can go through and drain your reservoir when you need to, and you might choose that you want to leave this longer, or you're going to go through and just unhook your pump or your reservoir out and dump it another way, so you'd go through and make this shorter. So I'm going to opt to make this shorter. So I go through and I attach it. I'm going to go through and just cut that here so it's not laying on the ground for people to trip over. But again, you could leave that as long or as short as you wanted. And then we've got our greenback valve here that goes through and just gets inserted into the line. And then when we have the system running, this will be off, so that it forces the water through these tubes into the channels. Earlier at the very beginning, we referenced gluing the channels and the drain line together. So that's already done here. But now, once we get water into our drain line, we need to be able to get that back to the reservoir. And this is what this assembly looks like. We've got our 1-inch slip to 3/4 inch female pipe thread bushing that is going to have the 5/8 inch barb threaded into it. But before we do that, so it doesn't leak, we need to go through and put Teflon tape onto the threads. Our Teflon tape is on. We go through and we start to thread that into our bushing. This is where our channel locks come in very handy. So we can go ahead and grab a hold of that barb. And we want that tight, but not so tight that we strip the threads off of this plastic barb. That plastic barb's threads are going to be softer than our Schedule 40. So just go through and get that snug. Don't over tighten it or it'll strip and it'll leak. Our PVC cleaner, we would clean the inside of this 90, clean the outside of this bushing. Then we would take our primer, prime the inside of this 90, prime the outside of our bushing. Then we take our glue. I like to put glue on the inside of the 90 and on the outside of the bushing. And then when I push these together, I like to be twisting it in the process so that if there are any barbs that are on there, we don't create a groove in our PVC glue where it could go through and potentially leak. We push that all the way together. We hold it for 10 or 15 seconds so that it doesn't end up pushing apart. And then we're ready to go and do the next part. In our kit came this pre-cut piece of black 5/8 tubing that we are going to attach to our 90 that is now glued onto our drain line. We go through and we push that up onto that barb. And then I've drilled this 1-inch hole with that step-up bit into our reservoir so that now, as water runs down our channels and into our drain lines, it goes through and returns back into the tank to be reused. Our channels are in place through and fits nice and happily into our drain line. Everything's fastened in. Now I take the feed tube and I go through and I drop it into the holes that are in our top covers. Now that we've got everything assembled and positioned correctly, we're gonna go and tighten our zip ties. And now we have our completely assembled 8.4 NFT system that's ready to have water added, nutrients, and the pH adjusted. Then we're ready for plants, plug it in, and you're growing. If you go through and purchase the optional light rack for your 8.4 system, what goes through and comes in that system is going to be 6 39-inch tubes and then 3 32-inch tubes, along with all of our connecting hardware. To go through and assemble this, you'll need that same 1/2-inch ratchet and socket, wrench, and our dead blow hammer. The 39-inch pieces are our vertical pieces, and they are attached to each one of the legs. So our 39-inch piece is our vertical bar. When we go through and we start off, we're gonna go at least 1 hole below this top rail through and choose however high you want this to be, depending on your light, or you can build this as high as possible and then use your ropes and your cables that come with your light to adjust the height of your given light. Well, so we're gonna attach it in 2 places. We're going to attach it through the leg and through the side rail here so that it keeps it from wanting to rack back and forth. So our first bolt goes through the leg and into our light support post, coming from the outside of that rack, all the way through, washer and nut. Again, I like to make everything finger tight, make sure everything lines up the way that it's supposed to, and then we'll go back through and tighten everything back up. So when we come to putting in our middle support for our light rack, it needs to go on the same side of this cross brace that the leg is on. Whether you have it installed on this side or your leg's on this side, it needs to be on the same side as the leg. Again, 1 hole below, and then we come through this side here, and then we come through this side here. And again, on the same side as the leg is on, 1 below, goes through, the second one goes through, we're gonna go through and put our top bars on. So our 2 outside top bars are gonna go to the outside, and then our inside top bar we'll put on the same side as our purlin support across the bottom here. So outside, putting our bolt head to the outside. Then for our middle one, I'm gonna put it on the same spot or on the same side of the post where our cross brace was going on for the base of the table that supports the channels. Again, that goes to the outside. Everything is loosely attached together, finger tight, and so now I'm gonna go back through and make sure I got everything tightened up, and then we'll put the finishing caps on. Last step is to go through and put these finishing caps in like we did on the base. Again, making sure that the notch matches the direction of the bolts. And so there we have it, your NFT 8.4 system with optional light rack and optional nutrient reservoir cart. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to CropKing. Thank you so much for watching.